Thank you, Nicola, and thank you to the Sixth Floor, of course, for hosting us, and thank you all for coming out, especially on this day in particular. I'm very enthused to hear more from Marc and have him tell you more about this just truly astounding book, the source of an incredible amount of resource, I should say the product of an incredible amount of research. And this is also a topic, I have to say, that is particularly personal to me at this time of year, because I have often contended that the easiest way to get sent away from my mother's Thanksgiving table is to say anything about Vietnam and Kennedy. That's the hot button issue in our house. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, because I can't say it at home. So.
And there's no invitation for me that's forthcoming, clearly.
No, you're not invited. No. So in any event, this is such a wonderful book and product with so much work. Could you tell us a little bit how you first got into this particular topic?
You bet. So first, it is a real privilege to be here today of all days. Thanks to Nicola, Kim, the whole team, and Jeff, to you for being willing to be in conversation about this. I work at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. We are an institute that studies the presidency, and we run a series of public and policy programs. And one of the academic programs that we run, research programs, is on the secret White House tapes that were made by and large from 1940 through 1973, with most of them coming from the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon presidencies. And our work on the Kennedy presidency led me to listen to several tapes that dealt with Kennedy's policy in Vietnam. And because of that, we were invited to participate in a conversation with a bunch of other scholars who were looking at the Kennedy-Johnson transition. What was Kennedy thinking at the time that he went to Dallas about Vietnam? What did Lyndon Johnson think Kennedy was up to at the time Kennedy went to Dallas? What did Johnson then follow through on? Was it Kennedy's policy, or was it something very different? And then what was the connection between that and then what eventually happened in July of 1965 when Johnson really fully Americanizes the war? And so we brought some of these conversations to this conference back in 2005. And one conversation was extraordinary for me. And it featured Bob McNamara telling JFK on the morning of Wednesday, October 2nd, 1963, after he and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Maxwell Taylor, had just gotten back from Vietnam, they give Kennedy this comprehensive plan for Vietnam as part of a McNamara-Taylor report. And what McNamara says to Kennedy and other aides there is, we need a way to get out of Vietnam. And to leave forces there when they're not needed complicates both their problems and ours. Now that's an extraordinary statement coming from somebody who 6-7 months later would welcome the conflict being known as McNamara's War. So what's going on here? Why is he speaking in such emotional terms? And you can hear him on the tape saying it. And then you can hear Kennedy, the National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, Taylor himself going back and forth about this. It's just an extraordinary moment, and one that we wouldn't have had otherwise, because there is no written textual memoranda of that conversation. The only record we have, real-time record we have, is the tape. So it launched me into an investigation of that period, this planning that was going on to get the United States out of Vietnam. When did it begin? Why did it begin? Who was in favor of it? What did Kennedy really think about it? What did the military think about it? What did the Vietnamese think about it? And when it was finally announced to the American public, later that evening, after a second meeting on this McNamara-Taylor report, because the full National Security Council met to debate its public articulation, how is it received here and abroad? What did our allies think of it? What did our adversaries think of it? And what did the South Vietnamese in particular think of it? So that's how this inquiry all began. And it started with a journal article that looked really just at the planning. And the planning to get the United States out of Vietnam was serious, it was systematic, and it was sustained. It lasted from the summer of 1962 through the fall of 1963. That is indisputable, certainly since the publication of the Pentagon Papers, because that included the McNamara-Taylor report. And we know that people had spoken of it earlier, and they spoke of it afterward, particularly in the oral history literature, and then it appears in the secondary literature. So that's what I was originally interested in. But to get a better sense of what Kennedy thought about the planning, I needed to get a better sense of what was his commitment to Vietnam in the first place, right? What did he think he was doing from 1961 forward, and even before that as he entered the Oval Office? But I couldn't leave it there. I needed to say something about what happened to that planning after Kennedy was no longer with us. What did Lyndon Johnson do with that planning? And then beyond that, since conversations about Kennedy and Vietnam have been such a part of the national narrative, certainly before 1991, but particularly after Oliver Stone's release of his film JFK that year, the conversation about Kennedy and Vietnam has affected the way we've thought about the use of force, and very much did so during the 2000s. I thought it necessary to make some kind of a comment on how the Kennedy withdrawal narrative has affected our national conversation. So therefore, it couldn't be just a journal article, it had to be a book. And that's what I've done right here.
Well, so let's unpack some of the details for people. I mean, obviously, you don't show up at the 6th floor in late November without a good understanding of the Kennedy administration and of Vietnam. But tell us more about the specifics of the withdrawal plan. What was, and maybe if you want to go back also, what Kennedy's initial inclinations towards Vietnam were.
Yeah, I mean, initially when he comes in, he feels a real sense of urgency to get on with this war. You can tell his impatience, certainly from the textual memoranda. We got to get moving, we got to do better than we've been doing. Let's get the country moving again was his mantra anyway, after the perceived torpor of the Eisenhower years, but particularly with respect to Vietnam, with respect to the kind of wars that he thought the United States would be involved in during this decade of development, the 1960s, when the wars we were most likely to be engaged in were the brush fire wars, sublimited wars, unconventional wars, not the conventional wars, battling with the Soviets, the Red Army at the Fulda Gap in Germany, right? So this kind of warfare is what we're looking at for the future. And early on in his presidency, both he and Secretary of Defense McNamara look at this conflict in Vietnam that is heating up, certainly since the latter part of the 1950s, as the Vietnamese communists, both those indigenous to South Vietnam and those in northern Vietnam, up north of the 17th parallel, began to build out their structures for prosecuting the insurgency. And so that happens, the National Liberation Front is created just before Kennedy becomes president. So that's what he's presented with when he enters the Oval Office. And Kennedy is very interested in meeting the communists, as others have written, on every front, and particularly on this front, because it jibed with the sense, the can-do ethos, I think, that Americans held at the time. As Arthur Schlesinger would write, we felt the world was plastic and we could bend it to our will. We could meet the communists at whatever level of engagement they wanted, all the way starting down at the unconventional war level, all the way up to nuclear weapons. So Kennedy was eager to see what could happen here and thought of Vietnam as a laboratory for this newfangled way of war. And throughout the course of 1961, as a presidential program emerges, and Kennedy sends Lyndon Johnson to Vietnam, Johnson talks about the need to help out the South Vietnamese. The war goes worse during the course of Vietnam. Kennedy is confronted with the prospect of the South Vietnamese, Saigon, our ally that we had been working with since 1954, essentially, going under. He makes a series of big decisions in late 1961 to amplify the American commitment to Vietnam. But crucially at the time, while he's willing to send in fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, better communications equipment, improving the amount of intelligence that we are gathering and sharing, more military advisors that had gone in. When Kennedy becomes president, there are only 685 military advisors. While he's willing to do all that, he is not willing to put combat troops in integrated units on the ground. That is one of the two decisions that he makes in November 1961 that cuts against the grain of almost all of what his advisors want. The other thing they want him to do is to make a full commitment to rescuing Saigon no matter what, right? Make sure that articulate that this is a vital interest of the United States and we will not let them go under. Kennedy refuses to do that. But when the military command in Vietnam becomes more enhanced, in 1962, we move from a military assistance advisory group to a military assistance command. No longer is a 3-star general leading our way, but a 4-star general. And there are all kinds of signs that this is becoming more important for for the United States. In April of '62, Kennedy says to his key advisors, essentially, I recognize what's going on, but I still want you to be live to the possibility of drawing down the number of forces that we have. It'd be nice if it was mutual and balanced, but he wants his key advisors to be looking for a moment when we can reduce our commitment. The following month in May, Robert McNamara goes out to South Vietnam. And our understanding, and the understanding comes from only one source, but he's a pretty good source. McNamara sits down with General Paul Harkins, head of MACV at the time, and says to Harkins, after the room is essentially cleared, when do you think you can start reversing the flow of American men coming into Vietnam? And Harkins is dumbfounded, right? He's just started to ramp up because MACV was just created 3 months earlier. Harkins says, it's not something I've really thought about. So McNamara says, look, the next time we get together with civilian and military officials, as they would do every couple of months throughout 1962, I want you to come up with a plan to get the United States out of Vietnam, essentially in a 3-year time period. So in July of 1962, we have great evidence that the United States began to plan to remove US forces from Vietnam. That plan gets developed over the rest of the year. It gets presented to several folks around the Pentagon in January of 1963. It gets refined over the course of 1963. It finally gets presented to Kennedy that fall after several other developments have taken place, including the Buddhist crisis in Vietnam in the summer of 1963, after things have gotten really kind of hairy in Vietnam. And it looks like the United States is on the side of religious repression. And our ally doesn't look like he's the guy that we really want to be allied with. So what had emerged originally as a plan that provided a framework for the United States to reduce its commitment to Vietnam gets transformed over the course of time into an opportunity for Kennedy to address a range of concerns, not just about America's presence in Vietnam, but around a variety of political concerns here at home. And so what I eventually argue is that while it dovetailed with his aspiration to reduce America's commitment, and I do believe that he aspired to doing that straight through the time he came here to Dallas. I also believe that when he signed on with this withdrawal plan, he was doing so largely for political reasons, especially as he was going to be going into an election year of 1964, but that it also allowed him to stay with the fight by telling the public that the commitment is not bottomless. It has its limits. And therefore, he could say to the people, we're going to be measured in our response. We're not going to go overboard. But we cannot cease and desist. And while this is not paying any price, and bearing any burden. It was still a burden that the United States needed to stick with. Patience and persistence being the watchwords of his presidency from beginning to the end. That was, in fact, one of the themes of the address he was going to deliver at the Trade Mart, were he to get there.
So you present a very interesting methodological and perspective conundrum, because you are telling us a story of American policymaking, American military policymaking, American political policymaking. You mentioned a few of the things going on in Vietnam, but for the most part, Vietnam is not actually an actor in the story that you're telling in some ways. Could you tell us, is there anything about this that is uniquely Vietnam, or should we really understand the American debates and commitment over Vietnam as just a Cold War battlefield somewhere?
It's a great question, and particularly a pointed one, because the Vietnamese were not party to the conversations about a plan that was ostensibly being developed in their name. I mean, in many ways, the war in Vietnam, whether it's 1961 to 1963 or post-63, was never really about the Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. It was about the Americans. It was about the United States in the world. And you can make arguments about, you can answer the question why Vietnam in a number of different ways when you start 1945, let's say. You can certainly say that there are economic considerations, particularly after the war was over and we were concerned about the Japanese and the need to integrate the Japanese broader into the economy of Asia, the need for markets and all that. You can talk about geopolitics and the need to support the French on the continent as the anti-communist bulwark, and that's all true. There is another consideration, however, that became more salient as the years went on, and certainly as the Japanese could stand on their 2 feet more after the United States leave and after Europe stabilizes. It's not such a fluid moment anymore in the Cold War. What really matters is American credibility, right? American resolve, our ability to follow through on our commitment to be the leaders of the free world, to lead the West in this international conflict against the forces of communism, which after having defeated the forces of fascism, many people thought that this was a much more dangerous conflict, kind of hard to get a whole lot of people to sign on to the specific dictates of Nazism, let's say, much easier with a purportedly a more popular and populist ideology such as communism.
Globally acceptable, much more than Nazism.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. So in this conflict, and particularly after we had spent $2 billion from 1954 through 1961 to help the South Vietnamese get up on their feet and then stay on their feet. I mean, without American support, the Saigon regime likely would have collapsed. Had there been a plebiscite as demanded by the Geneva Accords of 1954, virtually everybody thinks that Ho Chi Minh would have won that. For Saigon to have gone under, it would have said something about America's staying power, resolve to others around the globe. And Kennedy in particular, I think, I mean, this is a dynamic that's not peculiar to the New Frontier. I mean, this is something that others held on to as well. Dwight Eisenhower articulates the domino theory for the public in 1954. And there's an element of credibility and resolve there too. If it looks like you're throwing your ally under the bus, what is that going to say, again, to allies and adversaries? Are you really going to follow through on your Article 5 commitment in NATO to be willing to trade New York for Paris if push comes to shove? So what sustains the American commitment to Vietnam throughout the 60s is really this issue of credibility, what the United States looks like in the world. And that's true for Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon as well.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of NATO today, because, and neither of us are interested in getting into, in this particular moment, a discussion of contemporary politics. But it is a real good example of a different interpretation of America First, in the sense that the Kennedy administration conducts its operations throughout the world, but in Southeast Asia in particular, with a concern for what is good for the United States. Now that in this case, it means giving a lot of aid, it means giving a lot of energy, it means giving a lot of political support, but it's being done for the purpose of moving forward American foreign policy first and foremost.
Well, but to be sure, I mean, it's couched in a sense that it's good for the world, it's good for the Western world, and the model that we were offering, because right, this was a contest of development. Whose mode of development is going to prove more attractive to all of those nations who are emerging out of the yoke of colonialism, right? And the number, I've never been able to get straight on the actual number of countries that became independent in 1960. I've seen something like 17, I've seen it 19 or 21. Suffice it to say that those peoples were looking to the Americans or the Western model of development and the Eastern model of development, whether it's on a Soviet model or a Chinese model. Who's going to provide more sustenance? Who's going to provide resources? Whose way of modernizing and nation building, to use another couple words that have been buzzwords over the last 20 years or so, would prove most effective and most relevant for their situations. So what the United States is doing in South Vietnam is part and parcel of that whole conversation going on about the direction that history is moving in the world. And how can we help those forces of history? Right? One of Kennedy's top advisors in the campaign, and then he would go into his administration, was Walt W. Rostow, who is an economist, who wrote about these stages of economic growth, right? What happens when countries emerge or travel through those stages from a more primitive economy to a more highly industrialized economy. And he flattened much of that history out, right? But the argument was that we essentially can see how history is moving and we can help it along. And that, I think, was shared fairly widely, particularly by people who were coming into the new frontier, who thought that they could kind of bend history to their will. Again, as Schlesinger said, the world they thought was plastic and fairly malleable. And here was an opportunity to do so for countries, broadly speaking, but particularly countries in which, who were facing these insurgencies, right? Communism, and the communists were the scavengers of the modernization process, which is what Rostow said. And here's an opportunity for us to provide foreign aid, to provide civilian assistance, administrative assistance, to help people learn how to cope with the challenges that they were facing at home. It would be nice, yes, if they sided with us as well in the Cold War. But one of the interesting facets of the Kennedy period, and one of the reasons why Kennedy is such an interesting figure, particularly when you compare Kennedy and LBJ, is because he was interested in making the world safe for diversity, right? You didn't have to be on our side of the ideological divide to be seen as helpful in the Cold War. In fact, in some ways, it was just as well if countries stayed neutral. You know, there was a value in the Yugoslavs being not part of either camp, because we could say, we're not forcing them to side with us. And so there was that sense in the Kennedy period of making the world safe for diversity. Didn't mean that somebody who was already in the Western column could leave it, or that we were going to force a change from a country that was already in the Eastern column. But for countries that were on the fence, he didn't see the need to necessarily lever them into seeing things exactly the way that we did, although certainly it would have been beneficial, because it would have provided that sense, again, that history really is moving in our direction.
Well, and maybe this is splitting a hair for the people on the fence, but there's certainly a sense, and we can see this frankly from Woodrow Wilson all the way up through yesterday, and Kennedy's a good example of this, of even those countries that we don't want to push to one side or another, that are on the fence between communism and capitalism, between authoritarianism and democracy, we know what they should choose.
Yeah, right.
You know, there is a right choice here, and Vietnam has a right choice to make. And if you're not going to make it, that's not great for you. But there is a right choice from our perspective.
Yeah, there was a right choice, and hence the felt need to make the commitment to move things along the right way. It was a fraught commitment, right? It was a difficult commitment because of the South Vietnamese regime itself, run by first Prime Minister and then President Ngo Dinh Diem, who was working closely with his brother, political counselor Ngo Dinh Nhu, who had their own ideas about how South Vietnam should develop. And that's one of the signal challenges, I think, for historians to get a better sense of those two different visions of development, a distinctly Vietnamese approach to nation building. Building a nation that had not been a nation before, really, a South Vietnam, particularly after Geneva and after 1956. There really was a contest of wills. And again, you will see the Americans who are in South Vietnam get frustrated with our clients because they didn't want to do things our way. The South Vietnamese felt that tremendously and thought that at times the Americans had even gone overboard to support those forces who were engaged in launching coups against the South Vietnamese in 1960 against Diem, 60 and 62, and then ultimately in 63 as well. But the South Vietnamese, as much as they wanted America's support, large S, they were also fearful about the Americans getting too close to the South Vietnamese population. Right? I mentioned at the beginning that there were less than 700 US military advisors in Vietnam. By the time that Kennedy came to Dallas, there were close to 17,000 US military advisors in South Vietnam. And Diem's fear was that they were far too great in numbers. They were infecting the body politic. The fear is that the Vietnamese would begin to listen to the Americans more than listening to the other Vietnamese. It would look like Diem was a puppet. And that was really dangerous too.
We'll take a moment of silence.
You know, there's no great transition out of a moment of silence. I have one, though.
I'm glad you do, but can I finish my thought for a second?
You're kind of undermining my joke. But go ahead.
Tell the joke, because
go
jokes
ahead.
are all about
Go
timing.
ahead. Go ahead. You killed the timing already.
I'll create the context. This issue of the South Vietnamese and their concern about the size of America's footprint, it became so great in 1963 that Diem and Nhu start to encourage the American bureaucracy, first the US ambassador to South Vietnam, but then privately and then publicly, calling on the Americans to start to leave Vietnam. Right? There are too many Americans around here, and it's causing problems politically for Diem. at the same time that many Americans were wondering whether the real problem was Diem himself. And a lot of that conversation about the coup really starts to happen in earnest in the spring of 1963. So the American ambassador, Fritz Nolting, is really worried about this call for the United States to reduce its profile. But it factors into the refinement of the withdrawal plan that goes on that spring and summer. Like this planning to get the United States out of Vietnam, it will help us in a variety of ways, but it's going to help the Vietnamese too. And so while people in the American bureaucracy had different visions of what it was supposed to do, some saw it as a lever to force better performance out of the South Vietnamese. We're not here forever, right? You better get your house in order before we take off. Some saw it as an inducement. Okay, we hear you, right? We'll leave. We'll make things easier for you. It's not really clear what Kennedy himself thought of it, except for what we have from a few tapes deep into the fall. But suffice it to say that both sides were looking for opportunities to reduce the American profile, even if both sides were also looking to sustain broader American economic support for South Vietnam.
Well, it's such an interesting and unfortunately perpetual dynamic of interventions, not just for the United States, for I think most major powers when they intervene, at some point the government they're trying to help would like them to leave before they would like to go. Yeah. It just seems like that's a consistent pattern over and over again. Could you, just pivoting a little bit, could you say a little bit more about what the domestic political context was that Kennedy was dealing with in '63? I mean, one of the fascinating things about one of the touchstone books, I think, for our field, Fred Logeval's work on '65 and Americanizing the war, is how much he integrates Capitol Hill and how much he integrates Washington and how much he integrates the discussion going on in Washington. Again, perhaps more so than what's going on actually in Saigon and Hanoi. So what's the context that Kennedy's facing in '63 politically about Vietnam?
Yeah, so no joke. We're not at the
Oh no,
joke.
timing, you killed it. No. They are all going to have to be sad all weekend because of you, but don't feel any pressure on that.
So Congress was largely compliant, as Congress had been generally, with the executive branch coming out of World War II. And a lot of that related to the new nature of international relations and the nature of technological change and nuclear weapons. And by and large, Congress is kind of willing to let the president lead on foreign affairs. And that's still the case. It's very much the case here in 1961 and into 1962. You do start to get some questions about what's going on over there in Vietnam after we ramp up through what's called Project Beef Up in the fall of '61 and the spring of '62. More people are asking questions. I know there are military advisors over there, but we hear reports of Americans actually fighting and dying, and those were true, as much as the administration wanted to conceal what was going on. So there is a sense in Congress that the administration's not leveling with us. And that's expressed not only by Republicans, but Democrats as well. And that persists throughout 1962 and into 1963, when you start to get some Democrats talking about getting out of Vietnam altogether. I mean, Wayne Morse, who had become a Democrat, George McGovern, talking about getting out of Vietnam. It's not our place to be there for a variety of reasons. Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, eminence grise in the Senate, their former professor of Asian Affairs, who at one point was a real supporter of Diem, with Kennedy as part of the American Friends of Vietnam in the 1950s, goes over to Vietnam at Kennedy's behest in the fall of 1962 and comes back with a report that says essentially we're at the beginning of the beginning once again. Mm-hmm. And all the positive things I'd said before, I take them back now because we're in a heap of trouble. Kennedy hears this, at Palm Beach over the Christmas holidays, is really angry, mostly with himself because he believes it. And then that report becomes public in February of 1963. So Vietnam is on the public's radar screen in ways that it hadn't been previously, although I would argue it's not something that nobody knew about. And you ask 10 people and 9.5 wouldn't know where to point to Vietnam on a map. I think it was more, people had a sense of what was going on more so than that. Part of the research, I'm looking through Time and Newsweek and US News and World Report, and it's in there, fairly consistently. So at least a certain segment of the American population was attuned to what was happening in South Vietnam. And by and large, they started to wonder about the wisdom of the policy. Even though deep into 1963, Harris polls were saying by a 2-to-1 margin, they were on board with Kennedy's policy of continuing to prosecute the counterinsurgency, even with all the troubles that Diem was posing. It's an interesting conversation when we compare with Lyndon Johnson, right? Especially after 1965 and when Johnson's support starts to tank. At that point, the American public was largely bullish on the idea of flying the flag in Southeast Asia, that this is a fight that we needed to carry on. So publicly, there are these cross currents, as there often are, many in Congress asking questions, many in the public saying, yeah, we have these questions too, but we cannot cease and desist, just like the president told us we can't. So they're at loggerheads, as Kennedy himself would be, because he's getting different pieces of information from the civilians and the military that he sends out there. Yes, the war is going really, really well. No, the war is going really poorly. Things in the countryside are just fine because we're building more and more strategic hamlets, but all the intellectuals in the city and the Buddhists, they're parading, things are really bad. And so, as Kennedy would say after one particular fact-finding mission came back in September of 1963, you guys went to the same country? It's hard to make heads or tails from a policy perspective about what to do here. And so Kennedy, as was his wont, as is the wont of so many, decides to punt, believing that the time for harder choices lay further in the future. We'll get through this right now, right? We'll get through 1963, presidential election year of 1964. We'll figure out a way to talk about Vietnam, partly because of what they'd already announced in October of 63 about a plan to get the United States out by the end of 1965, but also to continue to prosecute the insurgency. We'll figure out a way to get there. And even as Kennedy's most ardent admirers maintain, JFK was likely to stay with the fight through 1964 into 1965. What happened then may well have been different. But then we have to look at what the constellation of forces would have been, and the third, fourth, and fifth order of magnitude counterfactuals that we would have faced 12, 16 months later on. How he would have sized up the possibilities for himself, what that would have meant for a second term, what would the political winds have been like?
Well, especially since we actually have these are third, fourth, and fifth order counterfactuals. But in the case of Vietnam, because it remains a central focus of American foreign policy, we do have a little bit more of a natural experiment that went on in that one can hypothesize, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, one could hypothesize that the pressures as 64 went on, especially if Goldwater gets the nomination for the Republicans, would have actually pushed President Kennedy away from withdrawal. I mean, it certainly pushed President Johnson into shoring up his right flank, if you will, against the accusation that we're not doing enough. Do you have a sense that that same dynamic I mean, it's counterfactual, but do
Yeah.
you have a sense from your expertise that that same dynamic might have played out in '64?
Look, Kennedy always ran to the right of whoever he was facing, whatever election it was. And there's no reason to think that he wouldn't have done so again in 1964. Lyndon Johnson, when he eventually did face off against Barry Goldwater, and Vietnam became a real thing in the summer of 1964 in August with the Tonkin Gulf incidents, Johnson was able to take Vietnam kind of off the table because of his decision to launch 64 sorties against North Vietnam on the night of August 4th. And he and Goldwater talked about that night, in fact. And so Vietnam no longer really becomes a major part of the election campaign. So strategically wise on the part of LBJ. For Kennedy, I mean, I see the historical path generally running in parallel with Johnson's through early 1964. I don't really see too many things being different there. The troops would have started to come home because as the withdrawal plan that was beginning to be implemented just after Kennedy's assassination. The idea was to take 1,000 troops out by the end of 1963 to kickstart this plan. That gets enacted. Now, not all 1,000 come out. The absolute number never goes down by 1,000. There were a variety of reasons for it. Kennedy never expected that the number would go down like that because this was largely for symbolic purposes anyways, just to demonstrate that we could do this. And I can talk more about that as well. But I believe Kennedy would have continued to implement the plan that he already supported. The concerns about Vietnam would have grown in December after the chaos following the Diem coup would have become manifest, right? Johnson sends McNamara over in December. McNamara and John McCone, head of the CIA, come back with this really devastating report of what's going on. Johnson gets very concerned. I want you all to don't go to bed at night until you believe that you've done everything you could to save Vietnam every single day. Johnson starts talking with key advisors about escalating the nature of the battle, maybe taking it to the Vietnamese communists more, going north of the 17th parallel. I would say that JFK was more bullish on covert operations and sabotage than Johnson was. He certainly was less concerned than Johnson was about the possibility of those activities prompting the Soviets and the Chinese to react in really negative ways. So I believe Kennedy would have continued that. Those operations themselves, once they flowered, ended up leading to intelligence and sabotage operations intersecting in the summer of 1964, hence the Tonkin Gulf incidents. I don't know that Kennedy would have reached for a congressional resolution like Johnson would have. Johnson, creature of the Senate, had been Senate Majority Leader at the time of Dien Bien Phu. Wrong. Minority Leader first, became Majority Leader in 55. But he was Majority Leader in 58 when the Americans sent troops into the Eastern Mediterranean. So it was a really natural thing for Johnson to look for some executive cover for what the executive was going to be doing. He helped provide that in 58. And then as Minority Leader in 54. Kennedy, I'm not sure he would have done that, but it's certainly plausible to think that with Vietnam becoming less stable throughout 1964, Kennedy would have continued with the deployments that were already underway. I mean, Kennedy never set a ceiling on deployments, and while they certainly were willing to reduce the number of men there, later on in the conversation that I referenced at the beginning, and they float this 1965 withdrawal date, Kennedy says, if 65 doesn't work out, we'll get a new date, right? We'll push it back. We'll do what we need to make sure, and certainly in a presidential election year, that it doesn't fall apart. So what does that look like? Well, maybe some covert operations, maybe a greater emphasis on an enclave strategy, to use other words that became familiar in the 2000s: to clear, to hold, and to build, right? To seep out in an oil spot fashion, to go against what the South Vietnamese wanted to do, which was to hold every inch of territory. Hold what you can and see what you can do to make the best of it. I mean, it's plausible to think that he might have done that prior to 64, prior to November 1964. After that, I think then we get into the realm of real speculation. But I think the historical path, the trajectory for LBJ and Johnson, LBJ and Kennedy, kind of is similar through much of, certainly the early part of 64, and then maybe even into the summer as well.
One last question, then I'll open it up, obviously, with our broader discussion. In 63, I'm not asking you to be inside John Kennedy's thinking process, but how much time was he able to spend on Vietnam versus other issues? I mean, Cold War is a big thing, civil rights is a big thing. You know, he's got a lot on his plate. How much is Vietnam how consuming is it for him?
Not very, right? His attention to it rises and falls as it becomes a matter of public conversation. So early in 1963, there's an engagement at Abbie, the hamlet of Bac, about 35 miles, I think it's southwest of Saigon. Goes really badly for the Americans and the South Vietnamese. There are images of American helicopters down. 3 Americans are killed. Kennedy looks at this, you know, I thought we were winning this war, what's going on here? It sparks a number of conversations amongst the administration and the military brass that leads to more task forces going out there. Kennedy tapes a bunch of conversations about Vietnam, and one of the virtues of the Kennedy taping system was that it was manually activated. So we believe when he turned the tape on, he thought it was a matter of real importance, right? When he didn't tape something, it doesn't mean that it wasn't important, but when he does tape something, it probably is important. So you can see Kennedy taping a bunch of conversations about Vietnam in January of 63. There's a very important conversation that he tapes with McNamara in May of 63 after McNamara gets back from one of these Secretary of Defense conferences, which I think is really revealing, particularly because it's a conversation in private. It's just Kennedy and McNamara, right? And if there are any shenanigans about, you know, we got to get out of there, and you're our guy to do this because you're putting the...
Why did he feel the need to tape the conversation between himself and one of his absolute closest advisors?
Well, I mean that goes back to why tape at all in some respects. And there's every reason to believe that Kennedy was going to use these tapes to write his memoirs. He was a writer. He was a historian, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. And it's a great way to capture what is going on. Johnson did so as well, although Johnson probably did so at least as much to hold other people's feet to the fire than JFK did. There was some suspicion that JFK wanted to tape his conversations so he could revisit them in real time to rethink the logic of certain decisions. But this one conversation that he has with McNamara on the 7th of May in 63, they talk about the planning that they're doing for Vietnam and the numbers that they're talking about, the sums that they're talking about. McNamara says it's just astronomical, and we got to take money out of this budget because Vietnam is going to become like South Korea to us. It's going to be a bottomless pit, and that's the last thing I want. So it's really interesting to hear McNamara talk about the fiscal context of America's commitment to Vietnam. And then they talk about what that means about trying to get 1,000 troops out, because that's part of the conversation as well. And Kennedy essentially says, well, you're not going to take those troops out if the war's not going well, right? That would be foolish. So we start to get a sense that whatever withdrawal happens, by the end of 63, 1,000 troops, by the end of 65, 16,000, assuming that that's where it remained, it's a conditions-based withdrawal, right? It depends upon how well the war is going. By the end of 63, that 1,000-man withdrawal was unconditional. Those troops are coming out. Why? Because their removal would have no bearing on the course of the war whatsoever. given what those people did. But what had started out as an unconditional withdrawal, we're going to get the American troops out by 1965, becomes conditional. Lots of things can happen between 1963 and 1965. We can fuzz it up. And the irony, again, as I say, is that both of those served his political purposes with Congress, with the American people, as well as with the way it looked to the rest of the world.
I, for one, would love to know what's going through your minds. Any thoughts, any questions? Sir.
Yeah. It's a great question. And it factors not only to McNamara's thought process, but to the thought process of people in the Fourth Estate, as well as legislators. So Mansfield frequently comes back to it, that he's concerned about this unconventional war that's getting hotter in Vietnam, coming to resemble the unconventional limited war, right? Not total war, limited war, and inconclusive outcome, right? Just an armistice in Korea. Another land divided between North and South and the instability that arises thereof. A lot of people start talking about the example for what we might be facing in South Vietnam. Both of them being led by leaders who are troublesome allies, Syngman Rhee, Ngo Dinh. The conversation about Korea becomes particularly acute in the summer of 1963 as the Buddhist crisis really starts to emerge, and you see it referenced more frequently in the papers. So it is a concern. For McNamara, part of it was a fiscal concern, right? This is the negative object lesson of what we want. But the military dimension of it too, and the political dimension of it, becomes a real concern for a lot of Americans. And so that's also what they're reacting to, right? If you're going to be saddled with that as you go into this election year, how do you defang that? How do you diffuse it? And even if you get through in November, you still got to do something constructive there. And what impact does that have on you? And even though that you're not running again, what impact might it have on your brother who might want to run in 1968? So it's a real concern. Please.
Broaden the geography a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, when you think of Kennedy as obviously more global than Johnson. And can you give some insights into what you're thinking in Cambodia and Laos during this time? And are they,
Yeah.
does he have his eye on that?
Oh, he very much, yeah, again, a great question. He very much has his eye on Laos. And in fact, it's on Laos before it's on Vietnam, JFK. It had come up during the transition meetings with Eisenhower, particularly in the very last transition meeting, which was on January 19th, in which Eisenhower says that this power sharing arrangement that had existed in Laos between neutralist factions and communist factions and royalist factions, if that breaks down completely and it looks like the communists are really in the ascendant, then you should go in unilaterally and clean things up. And we had certainly been involved over the past bunch of years helping the rightist forces in Laos, but Eisenhower was very concerned. He referred to it as the cork in the bottle of Southeast Asia because it was contiguous to all of the other countries. And so if Laos went, the others are going to go too. So as Kennedy comes into the Oval Office, that's his major concern. By the end of his first week in office, though, Kennedy receives a report from Ed Lansdale, who was regarded as kind of a guerrilla guru. He had helped Diem stand up his regime in 1954. He had gone to South Vietnam at the tail end of the Eisenhower administration, delivers a report to Kennedy. Kennedy sees it with Walt Rostow, and Kennedy looks at it and says, this is the worst one we've got, eh? And so that attunes Kennedy to Vietnam. So they're both considerations at the point, but Laos is cresting faster than Vietnam for a variety of reasons, not the least of which were logistical. How do you supply if we're going to deploy forces, even CETO forces? How do you really do this really effectively? Kennedy decides not to militarize that conflict. And it's one of the two achievements that he and Khrushchev arrive at in Vienna to kind of take it off the Cold War chessboard. And by the summer of 1963, they are able to neutralize Laos once again, although it's an agreement that doesn't hold. And to continue the thought, because it has a real impact on the war, the negotiations around Laos terrify the Diem regime because they fear that the United States is going to do the same thing to them, that ultimately the United States is going to look to neutralize Vietnam and leave. And again, you see in the documents the need expressed by Americans on the ground. We have to continue to ram this point home, that we're with you. We're not going to abandon you. Laos is one thing. It's different than Vietnam. The Vietnamese, the sense is that those people were made of sterner stuff than the Cambodians, and we're going to stay with you. But no amount of reassurance was enough at a time when the whole presidential program was built on the idea to embolden to stiffen the spine of the South Vietnamese. I mean, this was a fight that they had to win, right? And in favor of those who maintain that Kennedy was committed to getting out no matter what, he did say consistently, it's their war. They have to win it. And he said so publicly. At the same time, he's also using apocalyptic rhetoric about what happens if Vietnam falls. But he does say it's their war, they have to win it. And the Vietnamese are always fearful that they're going to be abandoned. And so it affects the decision-making as well.
One final question, sir.
You talk about Vietnam and controlling the communism and the dominance. Other than upholding the dominance, what strategic value Kennedy or Johnson or Eisenhower really felt that Vietnam had for the U.S.?
Not a whole lot. Right? So there were economic interests in the region: oil, rubber, tin, for sure.
Rice.
It was initially, as I mentioned earlier on with respect to Japan, valuable as a market. But a lot of those concerns and considerations start to fall away as the Cold War itself stabilizes, at least in Europe. It's not as stable in Asia. And what rises to the fore are these issues of credibility, America's position in the world, what it would look like if the United States goes back on its word and allows an ally who we have been with every step in the way to go under. Johnson himself, I mean, this is fast forwarding a little bit. Johnson had gone there in May of 1961 and had these conversations with Diem, and he's the Winston Churchill of Asia, as he would describe him. But in looking back, as he's getting ready to go big, according to George Reedy, Johnson's press secretary, Johnson felt that he had made a real commitment to Diem, a personal commitment to Diem, and to the survivability of the South Vietnamese state. And for him to go back on that commitment, let alone what it would have meant for Johnson's personal credibility, perhaps as a Texan, putting his tail between his legs and coming home running, or the partisan credibility of the Democrats once again letting a state go under. Who lost China? That debate was significant at the time. There are all these considerations about how credibility factored. It was geopolitical credibility, it was partisan credibility, and it was personal credibility for LBJ. And as much as that sounds like it's crazy these days, when you're not talking about the scramble for resources and making sure that those trading lanes remain open, there was still a real concern that the motive force in this whole arrangement was the People's Republic of China. And that if you embolden the Chinese to gobble up South Vietnam and Indochina, and then the dominoes really start falling, not necessarily by, let's say, marching into Burma or Thailand, but having those countries accommodate their foreign policies to Beijing, not being as supportive of the West in ways that might have made life a little bit tougher, that's a problem.
Okay, one final speed round question, which I think is how every interview should end, to be honest, with this question. What's your next book?
Boy, I've been sunk into the quagmire. I think I'm going to keep going. So
Once you're waist deep in the big muddy.
I am waist deep in the big money, and I have been listening to the Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon tapes for a long time. And as valuable as I've found the Kennedy and Johnson tapes to be on this particular era, I'm also really interested in what happens during the big war. I mean, the historians of the Vietnam War, the literature is really, really robust up through Americanization in July 65. It picks up again after Tet in 1968, but that period kind of end of 65 and certainly 66 and 67 is not as, has not been addressed as energetically. And because I have this proximity to the tapes, because it's part of my day job, I really want to use them to explore the politics of war. How do you conduct war in an environment that's starting to turn to your disadvantage? When members of your own party are taking you to task, what does that look like? All with an eye toward more recent developments in American foreign relations as well. I mean, I was writing this, certainly starting, during the years of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so a lot of the questions that Americans had about those conflicts are present in the way that I was trying to deal with this period. So I'll probably do something on the politics of war.
I want to thank you for demonstrating how historians interpret the concept of speed round. But more importantly, thank you all for coming today. And this is truly a wonderful book, incredible research behind this book. So I do really encourage you to pick it up and learn from it. And thank you to our hosts, and happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.